Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the massive NATO war games that were launched in Poland earlier this month. The large-scale military exercises along the Russian border have led to strong reaction in Moscow. Joining us now from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and political analyst with Sputnik International. Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Yes, nice to hear from you.
What is the Russian government's perspective on these NATO war games or exercises? Does the Kremlin see it as some kind of provocation?
Well, if you look at the facts, the facts are pretty menacing, because it's not just one exercise in Poland, Anaconda. There are also two other military games organized by NATO which are taking place simultaneously. There is Iron Wolf, which is taking place in the Nordic countries, and there is Baltic Ops, or Baltic Operations, which is taking place on the territory of the former Soviet Union in Lithuania and Latvia. So, of course, it is seen with concern in Moscow, because for the first time since 1941, even The Guardian daily reported it, for the first time since 1941, the German tanks rolled through all of the Polish territory, from the German border to the former Soviet border. So that is seen as something pretty menacing, because there are 30,000 people taking part in these exercises, including 40,000 American troops.
There was a recent report in Sputnik International, and it stated that these war games, and I'm quoting here, are a bid to reignite the Cold War intended to force Moscow to starve its domestic economy, to ramp up its military to meet a growing external threat. What do you see as NATO's motivation in carrying out these exercises?
Well, NATO's motivation is a big secret, which I think future historians will be able to decipher, because it is quite clear that when the NATO leaders say that Russia is an aggressor, that sounds very strange to us, because if the West had not operated a military coup in Kiev, which lasted for 3 months, Russia would have never taken Crimea back, and Crimeans would not run away from Ukraine as they did voting for reunification with Russia. And when we hear accusations that Russia is expansionist, well, it's enough to look at the map of NATO and the Soviet Union in 1991 and to look at the map of NATO and Russia now. You will see who was expansionist all of these years and who enlarged the territory.
Right.
That was certainly not Russia, but the West.
Right. You make that point there about NATO's eastward expansion. It incorporated a number of the countries that were formerly under the influence of the Soviet Union. How does Russia see NATO as a threat right now?
It is a big question, what are NATO's motives? The worst scenario is that the United States and the European Union simply want to dominate the world, and Russia and China, being large independent countries, they are in fact one of the few remaining independent countries in the world, so they need to be removed. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that the West is simply scared of us, that the West feels threatened. But to be frank with you, I don't believe this version, because the behavior of Poland and the Baltic nations is very different from the behavior of countries which feel threatened. If you feel threatened, you don't destroy the monuments of the potential aggressor. And in fact, in Poland right now, they're destroying the monuments to Soviet soldiers who liberated Poland from the Nazis, from the German Nazis in the 1940s. If you feel threatened, you don't make belligerent statements saying that your enemy is totalitarian and dangerous and bad. And these are the statements that we have been hearing from the Baltic capitals for 25 years. So it looks like the only possible scenario is that NATO indeed uses every opportunity to enlarge itself and to get closer and closer to the Russian military power, in the hope, probably a vain hope, to neutralize the Russian military power.
Right. Now, earlier this week, NATO announced that it will deploy up to 4 battalions to Poland and the Baltic states. This could mean that there could be up to 4,000 NATO troops on the border with Russia. How does Russia view a development like this?
Well, this is certainly not very pleasant news for Russia because, you know, the problem is not 4,000 NATO troops on Russia's border. Very few people believe that you can invade Russia with 4,000 men. You could do it 1,000 years ago, but not now. The problem is that the deployment of NATO forces to the west of the former Soviet border, it means that NATO no longer respects the 1997 Founding Act on relations between Russia and NATO. Let me remind you that this Founding Act was signed by Boris Yeltsin and NATO's leaders in 1997 in Paris. And that document says that NATO has no intention to deploy troops to the east of the line that once divided the Soviet Union and its Western adversaries. So this large-scale deployment of hundreds of American tanks right next to St. Petersburg in Estonia, you know, you can fly a jet in 5 minutes from St. Petersburg to Estonia. This is seen as a pretty menacing development. And don't forget that the second capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, is located just close to that area. So when NATO is concerned about Russian planes buzzing over its ships in the Baltic, it's enough to look where the United States is located you know, concerning the Baltics, and where the Russian territory, St. Petersburg, is located. The Russian planes were buzzing over American vessels that were in just a couple of dozens of miles from St. Petersburg, the second capital of Russia with 7 million of population.
You say these developments in Poland and the Baltic states are very menacing. Can we expect some kind of military response from Russia to these developments?
Well, actually, if you look at the strategy of President Putin, since NATO expanded to the Baltic states in 2004, Russia tried to sort of make a controlled reaction. And Mr. Putin stated it very clearly that we didn't welcome this development, but there was no hysteria in Russia around it after 2004. The message from the Kremlin to the population was that the Baltic states are not our enemies. NATO will not be able to invade Russia from their territory, so people should calm down. And now, after the tragedy in Ukraine, after so many Russian people were killed in Donbass and in other areas, people feel worried. And the Russian elite feels worried too. So there will be some kind of military response. There will be Russian troops deployed next to the Baltics, next to the Polish border, and that will not add to security in the region. Actually, an accidental confrontation, an accidental engagement of military forces in that area is not to be excluded.
Now, what about further NATO expansion? Ukraine still talks about its desire to join NATO at some point. Would that be a red line for Russia?
Well, Russia said very clearly that a formal inclusion of Ukraine in NATO will be the red line. And I think the main motive that pushed the Crimeans towards Russia and Russia towards Crimea in 2014, the main motive was to save Crimea from becoming a very dangerous military base for NATO's navy in the Black Sea. It is quite clear that the intention of the new Ukrainian regime is to join NATO. President Poroshenko and the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and others have been saying it quite openly during the last 2 years. So de facto, Ukraine is already a NATO member because American troops are now training the so-called Ukrainian National Guard, which is fighting the Russian-speaking population in the east of Ukraine. So Russia is already very concerned by the developments in Ukraine. I think a formal inclusion of a country like Ukraine or Georgia in NATO, it may spark even more radical reaction from Russia, because these are direct threats to Russia's national security.
There are some European leaders, opinion makers, including the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, who is saying that it's time now for the countries of Europe and Moscow to build better relations. And Schröder said that Germany's involvement in this NATO build-up that we've been talking about, he said, quote, "It's a big mistake does that encourage you that there could be some kind of deal between the two sides to diffuse tensions and assure Russia of its security?
Well, I think that Russia has been verbally reassured for so many years. For the last 30 years, Russia heard assurances from the West, from Washington, from Brussels, from Berlin, that there would be no extension of NATO, that NATO is not a threat, that Russia should feel secure. And little by little, all of these promises, all of these reassurances cracked up to be fake. So right now, I think Russia needs some real concrete steps from the West that would diffuse the tensions. I think stopping the military exercise and stopping the talk about a possible aggression from Moscow would be the welcome right step. But in general, let me tell you that, in fact, everything that happened was just a huge mistake of President Obama and the leaders of the European Union, because it's a lose-lose situation for both sides. The previous leadership of Ukraine, headed by President Viktor Yanukovych, it was not anti-Western. There was no immediate need for the West to remove Mr. Yanukovych. He was not an enemy. And the result of the revolution, so-called revolution in Ukraine, was that Washington antagonized Russia. It got the impoverished Ukraine on its hands. Europe has got the first civil war on its territory since the Balkan Wars ended in 1999. So it's a lose-lose situation for everyone, and the balance of President Obama, to my mind, is catastrophic. He cracked up to be worse than President Bush, the Jr., for the world peace. He does not understand anything about European politics, about security politics, and I think that sooner or later the American people will send Mr. Obama where he belongs, to the dustbin of history.
Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us, sir. And that's it for this edition.